Distinguished colleagues, dear students, esteemed guests, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to the 2026 Sakıp Sabancı Annual Lecture. Hoş geldiniz. My name is Turkish. I'm an associate professor of political science here at Columbia University, and I'm currently serving as the director of the Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies. The Sakıp Sabancı Center at Columbia University was established in 2016 thanks to a generous and visionary gift from the Sabancı family, with the aim of enriching the study of Turkish-speaking peoples from ancient times to the modern era, as well as the cultures and civilizations of the former territories of the Ottoman Empire and the modern Republic of Turkey. The Sakıp Sabancı Annual Lecture is the crown jewel of our center's programming. It has been established in honor of the late Sakıp Sabancı, a pioneering Turkish industrialist and philanthropist. For this year's Sakıp Sabancı Annual Lecture, we're privileged to host a true giant in the field of Ottoman historiography, Professor Cemal Kafadar of Harvard University. Introducing such an extraordinarily accomplished scholar as Professor Kafadar is a challenge all on its own. And I am delighted that my esteemed colleague, Professor Tunç has agreed to do the honors. Tunç is an associate professor of history at Columbia University. He's an expert on the social and cultural history of the early modern Ottoman Empire and its place in the wider world. He received his BA and MA from Sabancı University in Istanbul, followed by an MA and a PhD from the University of Chicago. Before coming to Columbia, Professor Shen taught at Leiden University, and he currently serves on the executive committee of the Sakıp Sabancı Center at Columbia. His research examines how peoples of the early modern Ottoman Empire perceive their world, the frameworks through which they organize information and beliefs, and the political, economic, and cultural structures that shaped and were shaped by their ways of knowing. His book, entitled Forgotten Experts, Astrologers, Science, and Authority in the Ottoman Empire from 1450 to 1600, was published by Stanford University Press in 2025. In addition, he has authored numerous articles on the history of science and divination, manuscript culture, the history of emotions, and the history of education in the Ottoman and broader Islamicate world. Professor Shen is currently working on the social history of knowledge in the early modern Ottoman world, examined through the microhistory of a scholar. In another ongoing project, he traces the social and cultural history of Ottoman manuscripts that ended up in the European collections as spoils of war or as booty captured by Mediterranean pirates. In short, I can think of nobody more fitting to introduce today's speaker than Professor Shen. Please join me in welcoming him to the podium to moderate today's event.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Shiksel, for this very generous introduction, and thank you all for joining us today. As Professor Shiksel mentioned, it's one of the most difficult tasks to do to introduce such a giant in the field of Ottoman studies. Professor Kafadar is one of the most distinguished and inspiring historians of the Ottoman world. Over the past 40 years, and exactly 40 years, since it was in 1986 that he received his PhD and published his first scholarly article, Professor Kafadar has shaped the field so profoundly that it's impossible to imagine Ottoman studies without him. His work has become essential reading for anyone interested in understanding the Ottoman past. I cannot possibly do justice to the full range of his scholarship, but let me mention just a few examples that have opened new paths for thinking about Ottoman history, society, culture, literature, and the lived experience of the past. His 1989 article on first-person narratives in Ottoman literature, for instance, helped define a new direction in the study of life writing among pre-modern Ottoman Muslim subjects. His edition of the Dream Diary of the 17th century Sufi woman, Asiye Hatun, brought to light an extraordinary source and offered us a rare glimpse into the intimate spiritual world of an Ottoman woman. His other publications on Istanbul, on coffee houses and the night, on vampires, on cultural geography and identity, on Janissaries, on Muslim merchants in Italy, and on the so-called decline of the Ottomans have expanded in their own way our sense of what Ottoman history is and how it should be studied. And of course, a special mention should be made of his book, Between Two Worlds, The Construction of the Ottoman State. Since its publication in 1985, Between Two Worlds has remained a true classic in Ottoman and Islamic studies. It offers a new way of thinking about the early Ottoman world that is far more fluid, socially, culturally, religiously, than had been previously assumed. Professor Kafadar's scholarly contributions, of course, extend well beyond these works I have mentioned. He co-edited with the late Halil İnalcık, Süleyman and His Time, and more recently, with Mümin Necipoğlu and the late Cornel Fleischer, the colossal two-volume Treasures of Knowledge, an inventory of the Ottoman Palace Library, to which Professor Kafadar contributed two important essays, one on Sultan Bayezid II and the textual culture of the 15th century, and another co-authored with Ahmet Kara Mustafa on works of Sufism and saintly lives. What has always set Cemal Kafadar apart is the distinctive quality of his voice as a historian. He writes with elegance, eloquence, clarity, and grace in both English and Turkish. In reading his work, one senses a lifelong devotion to language and literature, to poetry and philosophy. The poetic and philosophical formation he acquired early in life continues to live in his written work. Those lucky readers of his works in Turkish know this especially well from the titles of his books or from the long introductions he has written for them. For instance, in his Kim var imiş biz burada yokken, which can be rendered as Who was here before we ever were, Cemal Kafadar traces the lives of four ordinary individuals. The title of the book, borrowed from Karacaoğlan, the 17th century Anatolian folk poet, offers a moving reminder that history concerns what once existed more than, or rather than, what is simply gone. More importantly, this book speaks directly to one of Cemal Kafadar's greatest strengths in restoring dignity and empathy to people who might otherwise remain lost to history. I also want to mention something else that is especially characteristic of Cemal Kafadar: his long-standing interest in the relationship between cinema and history. His work in this area includes curatorial work for the Istanbul Film Festival and involvement in several film projects and documentaries, such as Inspirations on Sheikh Bedrettin of Simalna, the revolutionary mystic of the 14th century, and Ah Güzel İstanbul, a film directed by Zeynep Dadak and based on the 17th century Armenian Ottoman intellectual Eremya Kömürciyan's History of Istanbul. Over the course of a distinguished career, first at Princeton and then at Harvard, Cemal Kafadar has trained and inspired so many students who now teach at leading institutions in the US, Europe, Turkey, Lebanon, and elsewhere. I myself, unfortunately, never had the chance to take a seminar with him, But anyone who has had the privilege of hearing him in conversation knows that his influence does not reside only in seminar rooms or formal publications. It lives in meetings at the archive or at the Süleymaniye Manuscript Library, in hallway conversations at conferences, and in gatherings at Emek Cafe by the Bosphorus. So it is a real honor for me to welcome Cemal Kafadar here today. Please join me in inviting Professor Cemal Kafadar to deliver what promises to be an illuminating lecture.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Işıksel, Dr. Shen, colleagues, friends. But above all, to Dr. Işıksel and Shen for this very generous introduction and for their kind invitation, and to all of you for being here. And Sümeyye Yar for her kind assistance and for her patience with me. Those who know how I work will understand why I invoke patience. Now, let me start with this beautiful poem. The Angora goat. I'll come back to these pictures. That's the Angora rabbit. More than that. This beautiful animal is the true protagonist of my story and the core of my argument today. But I should start, while you look and ponder, with historiography. I have three historiographic points to make. One, the peculiar political landscape of the late Middle Period, that is between the Mongol eruption, as Marshall Hudson has called it, and late Middle Period, for those who know, is his terminology, or Middle Period. So the peculiar political landscape of the late Middle Period between the Mongol conquests and the three empires after 1500, Ottoman, Safavid, Mughal, 2.5 centuries roughly, are often not identified in their own right in the larger narrative of the study of Islamic societies and various other folks and communities who lived under the rule of what, for the sake of brevity, we just call the Islamic world. Later imperial historiographies, way before modern historiographies, had really occluded that particular period in terms of its peculiarities, with their obvious telos toward the Ottoman or the Mughal or the Safavid Empire or the like, or toward modernity, especially in terms of modern historiography. The second historiographic point I want to make is the teleology of the rise of the Ottomans, to which I have contributed in my own way perhaps. The teleology of the rise of the Ottoman Empire occludes the very peculiar political landscape of Asia Minor, more specifically, in the 13th to the 15th centuries. The larger occlusion to a smaller one. Gradual Ottomanization, that was my dear friend, late colleague Cornel Fleischer's most important late project before he could bring it to a completion, to look at this process of Ottomanization from the late 13th to the mid 16th century. So a gradual Ottomanization is a process and not as a telos of a drive toward Anatolian Turkish unity that inevitably would culminate in, well, unity. That was, of course, inevitable. That was expected. That was to be. Not that kind of fragmented picture of various chieftaincies and principalities, all of whom, for good reason, came under the banner of the Ottomans. That period again loses its own character and becomes a transition toward what became the triumphant Ottoman Empire. All competition and warfare among the different chieftaincies, principalities, and small or not so small but not large either political enterprises, including Sufi communities with political ambitions, one of whom succeeded the Safavid order, happened with an eye toward unity. in that kind of historiography that one needs to question more directly. And hence, the millennium and more of the history of Asia Minor after Mansikat can be told in a Trinitarian framework, which is now the standard, at least in Turkey, and not just in historiography, but all aspects of cultural life, Seljuk, Ottoman, Republican. Anywhere you turn, it's either Seljuk or Ottoman or both, or Republican or all three. For instance, the fabulously important and captivating cemetery in Ahlat is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I went to visit it again, and it is introduced as the Ahlat Seljuk Cemetery. The Seljuks, if they ever held Ahlat, held it for about 12 to 15 years. I really calculated this, I'm not just making it up. For 12 to 15 years. Otherwise, Ahlat, a very important medieval town, was held by various other rulers for a serious amount of time when that cemetery was formed, shaped, and inherited by later generations. Some of them also Turkish, but Kurdish, definitely, Arab, definitely. But it is that kind of eraser, that this Trinitarian framework that's happened. Seljuk, Ottoman, Turkish. Turkish meaning in this case, Republican. There is the beautiful, exquisite tomb, kümbet, that cone-shaped tomb building of Halime Hatun right by Lake Van. A few years ago, they built a terrible, terrible student dorm behind it. It ruined its view altogether. Now it's been demolished. That student dorm that was, for good reason, of course, with good intentions, built there, but really undermined the very beautiful view of this very exquisite and rare tomb building. Some well-intentioned folks, including some of my friends, went into the action when they saw that construction happening and said, "How dare you destroy this Seljuk beauty?" In Van, the Seljuks hardly ever ruled. Moreover, that building belongs to a Kurdish princess whose father built a mosque just a few hundred meters away from that tomb itself. So it was clearly part of another political equation that does not fall neatly into the Trinitarian framework. But that's just the way it's become. And I think, at least as historians, we should really be aware of the peculiar political landscape, the peculiar characters, different imaginations and ambitions of that late Middle Period, both broadly speaking, but also in Asia Minor. It's impossible to do justice to these 2 points historiographic points that I started with. I'll just mention it and move on to my third historiographic, or the real historiographic concern today, which brings in this character, namely the problem of the Republic of Ankara. Or should we think of it as the so-called Republic of Ankara? Now, many people who know much more about modern Ottoman, late Ottoman, and Republican historiography than I do know that starting around the middle of the 19th century, a certain interest started in the medieval past of the Turks, the Ottomans, so on and so forth. Namık Kemal wrote this book on the Harzem Shahs, Khwarezm Shahs. Abdul Hamid commissioned a group of intellectuals, including people of different skills, to look at the birthplace of the Ottomans, where the Kayı, or in fact the Karakeçili, even a smaller unit, tribal unit, is supposed to have hailed and then led to the triumphant Ottoman state. But with regard to Ankara, the raging debate really came between two decades, between 1913 and 1932. In the context of the Milli İktisat movement, or a national economy movement, and the more specific movement within its umbrella, mesleki temsilcilik, very hard to translate, especially the way they meant it, but something like representationism of professional communities. That was under the umbrella of RELIC, national economy, which first the CUP, Committee of Union and Progress, and then the early republic, in different ways and with different foci, encouraged and upheld, which was meant to counter what was perceived as the domination of the economy by non-Muslims, serving as agents of imperialism, perhaps. There are different degrees of these kinds of assessments. And eventually to create, to counter that, and to eventually to create a national bourgeoisie. That the CUP clearly, explicitly avowed. And Zafer Toprak, Selim, İlhan Tekeli have written beautifully on those decades and the larger world economic and Ottoman economic context of this phenomenon. But it is within that context that the so-called Republic of Ankara came into a raging debate. The debate was interested by and in response to two reports prepared for the Committee of Union and Progress on the akhis in the early 19-teens. The reports were in the 19-teens. Akhis I'll explain better, but for now let's just say medieval confraternities based on principles of futuwa for those who know medieval Islamic history, but medieval confraternities. So debate was initiated by and in response to two reports prepared for the Committee of Union and Progress in the 19-teens because they wanted to look for some past in which a national economy had once expressed itself and might again be revived or could be a source of inspiration. Eventually, many of the historians and savants of those decades joined the fray. I'll just mention a few names: Ahmet Tevhid, Mehmet Fuat Köprülü, Ahmet Refik Altınay. They all had something to say about this, and often based on primary sources. Everybody agreed that the akhis, these members of these medieval confraternities, were important and that their experience mattered in the thinking of a national economy now, but the major questions revolved around their politics. Who were the akhis? And did they play certain political roles? Yes, they did play certain political roles, everyone agreed, in the absence of states. That's obvious enough. But did they ever attempt or enjoy independent political power? To be considered one of the tawaif-i-muluk, again, to use a technical term, one of those multiple chieftaincies and principalities that characterize that fragmented political landscape. From Arabic, Tawaif Muluk, it's also used for Iberia. Once the Reconquista begins, Iberia and Anatolia both have that kind of puzzle, which eventually leads, of course, to two different unifications at the two ends of the Mediterranean at the end of the 15th century, the Ottoman and the Catholic Spanish Kingdom. So, could they be considered, did they enjoy enough independent political power? Did they imagine themselves to be such to be considered one of those taifas, one of those tawaif muluk? These debates were raging. And the claim with regard to the akhis of Ankara, of the city of Ankara, members of the same type of medieval confraternity in Ankara, were deemed to be the most audacious in this kind of imagination by the people who thought that there was indeed a republican type of entity created by them. This has partly something to do, and I'll get into that as well, that with the fact that the city, the incorporation of the city of Ankara into the Ottoman realm remains ill understood. Who did they take it from? Was it through warfare? When exactly? Types of questions come behind this raging debate. I gave you the context, but there are specific points that people argued for and against on the basis of some primary source research, as historians do. Could it have been in the hands of akhis, the city, who considered themselves independent of any other principality, in some form of governance that resembled a mercantile republic? These members of the medieval confraternities were mostly artisans, tradesmen, and merchants. Did they defy the Ottomans? Or was it a conquest by force? The acuity of that question should be obvious also because we're on the eve of the establishment of a republic. 1920, 21, 22, 23. In fact, Mustafa Kemal, in a conversation with a journalist in January 2023, 10 months before the declaration of the republic itself, which is in October 1923. October 1923, the journalist, the interview is taking place in January, 7 months before that, in Eskişehir. And in that interview, Mustafa Kemal says explicitly, we are thinking of forming a republic or something to that effect, and it is indeed in this land where there used to be a republic. As we know, he's reading some of these characters I mentioned, like Ahmet Tevfik, Köprülü. These are all in his library with marginal notes. So he was following the discussion, and he was of a certain opinion, which then he turned to his purposes. Now, the issue, the debate, the positions taken were also obviously loaded with political ideological charge, that it invites itself to be dismissed as ideological or nearly ideological, whatever that means. It's a red herring of historians. But it should be noted that the dismissal itself is likely to be ideological. In fact, the debate came from people, as it does to this day with historians with their own positions. The people deeply concerned as to what they would find and what consequences that would lead to. And some undoubtedly were manipulative, but not necessarily everyone who was part of the debate. And it's important to look at what they studied and how they understood it. And there are also more recent publications of some sources which I will come to indicate my point. So, Mehmet Fuat Köprülü, for instance, would argue that there's no way that that would be something like an independent government by akhis of Ankara. They cannot even be a quasi-state, like adeta bir devlet. Impossible, Köprülü thought. Could some upstart, or should I say startup akhis, craftsmen? I think startups. Could some upstart craftsman be in a position to consider defying the Ottoman roller coaster? I'm exaggerating, but this is Köprülü's question, stated in a more scholarly fashion. If you think I will answer this question right away, you are wrong. Before I turn to the sources regarding that particular episode, the conquest of Ankara, from whom, when, under what conditions, exactly. Before I turn to the sources regarding that particular episode, let us now look at the material ground on which the akhis of Ankara became a force to contend with, and eventually, from the point of view of the Ottomans, subdued and even prized as major economic actors for centuries. That takes me back to the goat and to the akhis in a more explanatory fashion. So far I've called the members of medieval confraternity. Now, Futuwa associations were formed long before the 13th century. In various cities, these are urban, this is an urban phenomenon. In various cities of the Levant, of Iraq, of Egypt, where associations of young men, the word futuwa is somewhat like virtu, the qualities that one expects a man, or a young man to have. Vir, man, to, right? So in the same fashion, futuwa was what a feta, a young man, plural fityan, ought to carry oneself with. Qualities of morality above all, summarized often in modern Turkish with the trinity of el, bel, dil, you are vigilant about where your hand goes, and that's against avarice and theft. You should be mindful of your value or waste, which is against adultery. And you should be mindful of your tongue. These rhyme in Turkish, el-beldi. You should be mindful of your tongue, which is, of course, about ill-speaking of others, gossip, etc., etc. So certain moral principles applied or adhered to is yet another question, but repeated in several books, code books of the Futuwa associations, and eventually translated into different languages, were around by the time Futuwa came into Anatolia in the 13th century under the direct participation and eventual inspiration of one of the most famous Sufis of the time, Sukravarti. Representing the caliphal authority in Baghdad, he introduced Futuwa to the newly growing Turkish Muslim communal life in Anatolia, and it found a fertile ground. The Turkish word ahi, two etymologies for it, is either from Arabic, my brother, ahi, or from the ancient Turkish word, as Louis Bazin once argued, from the ancient Turkic word akhı, which means generous. And the translation of Futuwa into Persian is in fact Cemal Mervi, cömert. Generousness is embedded. No matter what the etymology, both values, both attitudes of being with brethren, solidarity, and being generous were part, at least in principle, of course, of the moral code and behavior of the akhis of Anatolia, who thereafter, from the late 13th century onwards, we see all around. I'll show you a map of the spread of akhis from 13th to the 15th century, as mentioned in various sources. For all my slides and all my maps especially, I am deeply indebted to Eda Ezer, my dear colleague, and could barely manage. These Futuwa associations that I mentioned, in that fragmented, challenged political landscape of the late Middle Period, could also turn themselves into some kind of local power, especially in the absence of strong states. And Futuwa associations thus started to play the role of some political agency, sometimes serious political agency in different cities, as after the Mongols, larger states were not around in that part of the world. The late Middle Period, in other words, offered many moments and many spaces for non-state actors to appear in new roles, including militia, some of them. And similar words or words used to the same effect like ayyar, ayyarun, renewed, while used alongside words like feta, fityan, often had other connotations of being derelict, of being not necessarily of upright moral behavior, etc., etc. So moral behavior and political behavior start to show a bigger range than what I described to you earlier, depending on local contexts. A certain Ahijah, for instance, enjoyed Tabriz for a brief period of a decade as his throne city, the way Mustafa Ali describes Payitaht. He probably was not enthroned in the serious sense of the term, but akhis, members of these kinds of associations, could capture power in different places in different ways. But that I mentioned as the late Middle Period offering many moments and many spaces for non-state actors. It obviously required more than opportune moments and spaces, and more than traditions of solidarity. It also depended on resources. Resources, though, are not inert matter. We know now very well from our own extractivist world. Resources are not inert matter that you happen to find and deploy. They are rather what we make of them, with them, through them, including remaking them with technique or metis. Slight. The first two sentences would sound like a digression, but believe me there. From the point of view of Turkish history, for instance, of the late Middle Period, what we have after the Mongols is the second big wave of migrations. The first wave came right before, during, and immediately after Mansikat, from Inner Asia, from the steppe world into Iran and more westerly Asia. But the second big wave of migrations might be even more important in terms of certain types of consequences, demographic and technological, I would say, but that's a longer discussion. But it's to that period which happened after the Mongol eruption, namely from the 12th, 20s, 30s. In fact, for all we know, the eponymous founder of the Ottoman Empire is Osman Gazi, as you all know. Osman's grandfather came to Anatolia in flight from the Mongol onslaught. It's that generation of people, like Hacı Bektaş and several others, Mevlana Rumi in another way, running away from Central Asia back to Konya, so on and so forth. It really is a very important thing to realize with regard to the circumstances of the 13th century, especially after Genghis Khan. People fleeing. And of that period, Yazıcızade Ali, one of the most interesting authors of the 15th century, looking back a few centuries, writes, the August people, when they were in Turkestan, now he's writing this in Gallipoli, in Western Asia Minor, over to Thrace. The August people, when they were in Turkestan, were Mongol-faced, and their dialect was also close to them. Lehçe. Moğol suret ve lehçeleri dahi. When they came to Iran land, Iran Zemin is a very important concept that we don't translate as Iran land anymore, but we should. Really, that's what it means. It's a notion, no matter what the politics of Iran, that's deeply rooted in Iran, that there is a land that's identified as Iran Zemin. Anyway, so when these Oghuz people, who used to look Mongol-faced, when they came to Iran land and the lands of Rum and Sham, namely to Anatolia and Syria, their look turned Tajik-faced, and their tongue became smooth and soft. It would take a whole lecture to say who the Mongol, what is meant by Mongol and Tajik. But the point is the Tajiks are urbanites of the Western Asian space in this period. Iranians are mostly what is meant, but not only. So from being Mongol-faced, they became Tajik-faced within 2 centuries, according to his ethnogenetical explanation of the people of the lands of Rum, who now are called Turks or Rumis, but now we're in this new geography. Gelibolu Mustafa Ali, again from the same city, interestingly enough, in the late 16th century would write of the coming together of different peoples in the lands of Rum as if one were grafting different fruits, different trees, and creating new species. So there was an understanding of a conversion, I don't mean religious conversion, of course, of a change, of a transformation, ethnogenetical transformation happening during and after these huge waves of migration, as happened, of course, with the Völkerwanderung in Europe. And really, where are the Normans now? Or the Visigoths? Along with the human bodies and faces and dialects, the animal world also started to change. Because people, no matter what kind of warfare is part of this phenomenon, ultimately exchange information, ideas, techniques of doing things, da-di-da-di-da. For instance, we know very well that camels were hybridized by the migrants to Asia Minor. The dromedary, the single-hump dromedary of the Arab world, and the two-humped Bactrian camel were, what's the word, mated?
Interbred.
Sorry, bred, brought to breed together
Tinder.
I have other words, but I won't use it in this company. And because the backing camel had certain qualities that the dromedary did not have, and vice versa, and one wanted to have something that brought the advantages of both into play, we know that a hybrid kind of camel emerged in the area from the Caucasus to the Balkans. Recently, Alexander Shopov has studied the very detailed documentation of the planned creation of a camel breeding village near Thessaloniki. People were settled there, 2 different kinds of camels were sent there, the archival documentation is there, and a new kind of camel that would be much more useful in Rumelian caravan trade were then deployed, created and deployed. So, the goat. Now, for all we know, the goat, or something very close to it, existed in ancient Rome, as one sees on sarcophagi. To the degree, of course, we can take those as realistic depictions or not, there's some debate, but something like it existed. So it was a local animal. But for it to turn into a much larger resource for a much larger industry, one has to wait until the 14th century. There was clearly, for this, we don't have as good archival documentation as Alexander Shopov has for the 16th century camels. Those of you who know the Ottoman archives know that the 14th century hardly offers anything. But there is clearly something happening to goat breeding in Asia Minor, around the city of Ankara, that then creates this wondrous, wonderful, beautiful species being that will be part of the rest of my story. So, here you have a German depicting Süleyman the Emperor, very fanciful, but with an Angora goat. By then the industry was booming. So the Angora goat, remember, has a motor, so it has a ball, a globe under its feet. It offers the world to Süleyman. Hey. Ankara is also famous, very briefly, for the similarly significant, similarly interesting and beloved fleece of its rabbits and cats. And here you see 3 of them posing together for you. Okay. And Ankara was one of the well-fortified cities. I'm not going to dwell on this, but that's important, of course, especially for the medieval and late medieval period, for city folk to consider themselves, if they did consider themselves a political entity, to consider themselves somewhat protected, relatively immune to mighty armies, or less mighty armies, especially coming from afar. This is the city, the fort over there, flourishing. That's the picture on the poster. Flourishing in the 18th century. This is by a Dutch painter, Filiz Yenişehir and colleagues have studied this painting in great detail in a book. It's not meant to be a one-shot realistic depiction of Ankara, by the way, if you look at the poster carefully. It is meant to give you different moments in the city's industrial life. So, in fact, the wall facing the street is lifted by the painter to show you that much of the industry is happening inside the homes. Women and slaves are part of the spinning and weaving and whatever else is going on. And of course, if you study the costumes closely, you have definitely 3 ethnic communities well represented: Muslims, Armenians, and Jews. And here you see caravans leaving, and we know, in fact, the camlet trade caravans left Ankara all the way to northern Italy and all the way to Afghanistan, or what then was probably western lands of Hind, western India. script used in European languages for the kind of woolen textile that was made from these animals is unfortunately not well known today. How many people have heard the word camlet? Hey, that's great. Camlet used to be a very common word in the textile industry. Various European equivalents, Zamelotten, Gambelotten in German, Giambelotti, Zambelotti in different Italian dialects, and it's all over the place in the account books of Italian merchants, for instance. Here, sorry, this is really from an etymological dictionary, I think it's Webster's, which says, for camlet, a medieval Asian fabric of camel hair or Angora wool. And it says first known use 14th century. So from the 14th century, remember the point of akhis of Ankara, the conquest, sometime in the mid 14th century. That's when the word camlet is now introduced into the English language. It comes from the Arabic word hamla, which is a fine, thin fabric. Many of the words of this industry that survive in English are actually from Arabic, like mohair is from muhayyar, wavy. Hamla, camlet, so on and so forth. Now, this is an exercise for me to I'm sorry about this. Before this one I put after Eda gave me her beautifully presented materials. In the last minute in the hotel, I added this where Mustafa Ali about Ankara, about Ankara in about Ankara says, this is now the late 16th century, he says, oh, that's the city of Sof. Sof is the Turkish word for that textile, woolen textile. And then the dictionary of Meninsky, many folks here who are Ottomanists use it, late 17th century dictionary by a dragoman. Here, Sof, among other things. You see capripyrium, goat hair, shamlot, zamelot, jambelotto, camelo, are all from the word hamla. And by the time Meninsky is writing, these words are recognizable to his audience speaking these different languages. Mohayyar here goes into mohair, again he mentions Shambelota. And the word, that's another side story here, what about Greek, for instance? In Greek too, they use the word samerota, meaning that there was no indigenous Greek word for it. To me, that's what it implies. Though there's much more to be done on this front, but it's the kind of evidence that one shakes this way and that way and thinks. And I don't think on the basis of this one would simply conclude as widely as I thought I would. So then, Angora becomes a huge part of world consumption culture. Here you have even, I didn't know about this, Laurel and Hardy, they have a short with Angora, with a goat actually, they try to acclimatize in their home. But you have this famous Lana Turner pose over there with Angora. Can you see? This is, what's his name? Ed Wood. This at the top is Ed Wood. Is this the famous actor, the pirate? What's his name? Johnny Depp. Oh. So, in a transvestite kind of thing, this is Lana Turner. Why don't
He's playing the goat.
Because it's a screen, it doesn't show the head. Anyway, but you got my point. So, I think the highlight was really in the 1950s of Angora as a logo. To this day, it is known by people who are discerning in their purchases. Does anyone here have Angora or mohair with them? Today is a very warm day, probably not. But you know what I'm talking about, yes. Right? So, what happened in this instance is there something will happen with this? Doesn't matter, let's drop it. Let me just continue. Something interesting here before we get to this point. Up until the early 19th century, the Ottomans did something very specific with regard to the Angora woolen industry that they didn't do in other industries. Namely, they were protectionists. Just like mercantilists, one could not buy, foreigners in other words, coming to the Ottoman Empire for the import-export business, could not buy the raw wool. They could buy raw wool of the sheep regularly. They could buy raw cotton, as studied by many colleagues who are economic historians, but there was strict protectionism with regard to Angora wool, so that only textiles would be sold, not the wool itself, up until the early 19th century. And now I will read to you from the Australian Chamber of Commerce what happened after that. The first European records of the Angora there are several European records of the Angora wool going back to the early late medieval period. In 1820, the Ottoman Sultan allowed the export of raw mohair from Istanbul to Europe for the first time. The precise date might be debated, but sometime during the reign of Mahmud II. The United Kingdom rapidly mastered techniques for spinning mohair, and soon the demand for raw mohair was greater than Turkey could supply. Turkey meaning here the Ottoman Empire. So raw mohair is going, it's being produced as textile in the UK, but not the animal yet. There have been many attempts during the 18th century to acclimatize the animal in different parts of the world by Europeans. But they could not succeed until 1849, when 7 does and 2 bucks arrived in South Carolina. Before that, and right after it, people were trying in France, but ultimately it was really in southern United States, now in Texas, and in Australia, and in South Africa, that the animal, before the end of the 19th century, was successfully acclimatized, and Ankara's fortunes dropped. By the time the Republic is being considered and created, most people speak of Ankara as a sad city, right? As a sad place. But it is a 19th century story, actually, that moved from that very flourishing picture that I showed you to what we have in the late 19th, early 20th century. This is the Angora Poets Cafe in Paris. In case you haven't. So the word Angora lives in different kinds of environments for different kinds of ends, but this is an interesting phenomenon I found out on the internet. Angora Poets Cafe. Paris Cafe. Now I'm going to my point. Let me rush then. This is, those of you who cannot read it, Ibn Battuta's travel paths in the 1330s in Asia Minor. Let me skip over a few things. I always like to explain on the fly. That takes a... Let's go back to the 14th century and see the very beginnings of this industry at the moment when the Ottomans were not quite there. The peculiar political order of the city is elucidated within the narrative of the Ottoman conquest of Ankara in different sources, but many of them are really simply one sentence about it. And then the Ottomans took Ankara, or Ankara became Ottoman. Some of them are in fact totally silent about it. The earlier chronicles, like Aşık Paşazade, like Uruç, speak about Ottoman conquests in Anatolia merely, not conquests, but say captures in Anatolia, in Pacific, in peace-minded incidents. One of them has to do with the dowry of the Germanic princess. There's a marriage, and much land of the Germanics is given to the Ottomans without any warfare as dowry. And the other one is a purchase, a legal Shar'i Mektub is said, a legal Shar'i document between the Ottomans and the Hamidoğlu which gives all the area around Beyşehir, Eğridir, beautiful area by the way. Like if you think about real estate, through this purchase. That kind of thing. No mention of any warfare against any of the Turkish Muslim principalities in Asia Minor. Not at this point. After with Bayezid, certainly. Bayezid is the bad guy of these early conflicts. But the first three rulers are sturdy people. They never did any wrong. Fratricide, for instance, these sources say starts with Bayezid, the fourth ruler. The first three never engaged in it. But we know well that Murad, the one who eventually conquered Ankara, in fact, had to, but did, kill his brother and two of the parents. So the chroniclers need to obviously be read with some caution and some critical distance. And with regard to Ankara, the 15th Angora, the 15th century sources are either silent or say very little. In the 16th century, we begin to get some detail. One of the important details is that Bayezid took it, but only after obtaining a fatwa. Idris Bitlisi writes this, Cemal Kafadar writes this. These are early 16th century chronicles. Namely, Murad thought it would be wrong to attack a Turkish Muslim principality or power of some kind, any kind, so went to the Mufti and asked if it could be legitimized by the fact that they are engaged in evil deeds. And the Mufti's response was, well, it is so important to engage with sedition within the community that it really supersedes even fighting against the infidel. So that was the fatwa received. On the basis of that fatwa, supposedly, Murad captured Ankara. We still don't have the akhis really quite there in the picture. Now let me finish with the akhis in those two other 16th century sources. One of them really recently discovered, and that to me is the most helpful one. Hoca Saadettin, not so recently discovered, but this section has been overlooked, I should say, says the conquest, as Avi Noam knows in a conference that he organized, is we modern people translate fetch as conquest with some error. Because fetch is opening, and it's only the good guys who can do that. What the evil guys do is not fetch. In modern languages, we just translate conquest into one another, right? The Habsburgs conquered, the Ottomans conquered, the Chinese conquered, It is not exactly on an egalitarian footing that conquest happens, or conversion religion-wise. You turn Turk, or you become heathen, instead of converting to Islam in medieval and early modern European usage. Likewise, you become Nazarene, tanassur etmek in Arabic, Ottoman Turkish vocabulary. We don't just convert to Christianity. We have become much more genteel in the way we treat these communal relations of conquest and conversion. Are you with me? So, he is actually saying the opening of Ankara. That's a big word. That's a very loaded word. It's not the taking of Ankara. The opening means opening it to the true faith. Opening of Ankara and the subjugation of the gang of tyranny and malice. These are the akhis of Ankara. After his accession to the throne and taking care of the most urgent matters of the people, İtmam el-Eham Cumhur, the Sultan wishes to undertake jihad and conquest in Rumelia. I summarize the rest. But while there, he receives the news that some rulers and kings, Hükkam and Muluk, in Asia Minor, take the road to an alliance in the path of discord and enmity. Now I translate verbatim. Specifically, the rulers of Karaman and Little Armenia, infidels, and some that's a Saidisha, right? And some ill-intentioned emirs hear that the Shah, Murad, has moved toward Gallipoli and intend to plunder the well-protected lands of the Ottomans with devilish plans. They also contact some infidel rulers in the area, these devilish plan concocting people. They At this point in Asia Minor, by the way, that's another thing that's often overlooked in the path to the unity. The area from Antalya to Ayas is held in the hands of different Christian condottieri, so to speak. They also contact some infidel rulers in the area and try to move against the Ottomans. Murad, obtaining a fatwa from the renowned ulema, passed over to the Anatolian side from Thrace, and with his victorious soldiery besieged the fortress of Ankara for the sake of fortifying the Thugur. Thugur is a medieval Arabic word very important for medieval Arabic history. The borderlands, like the Turkish word uç, the frontiers. So Ankara at this point is considered Thugur. And Murad is moving there for Seddisu Thugur, to fortify the Thugur. It's another thing about geography, right? I mean, Sivas and Amasya will be Thugur in the age of Selim. But the whole phenomenon of Anatolia somehow becomes Ottoman as soon as it established the state in the early 14th century. Anyway, so those who possessed Ankara, Sahibi Ankara, I continue with his vocabulary, who were known as akhis, that's his language, had seized that castle and environments through usurpation, tagallüp tariqiyle. Here, an Ottoman author of the 16th century is writing about the akhis of Ankara and using a word that the Republicans will use for the late Ottoman usurpers, mütegalliben, right? Tagallüp tariqiyle, and proclaimed independence or sovereignty, difficult to translate, davai istiklal. But the word istiklal is used in this late 16th century source. When they observed the might of the just Sultan, they realized their inability to counter it and instead expressed their obedience to the sultanic threshold by sending precious gifts. That's one of them. There's more detail, for which one sentence I need to read. That country region, this author ends, Kishvar, of pure profit, has an abundance of cultivation and lifestyle. Soft and mohair and various exquisite textiles are produced in that land and reach the lands of the Arabs and Persians and Rome and the Franks. That's the reputation Ankara has at that moment, and attributed to it for already the 14th century, and I think for good reason. The other source I have is Celalzade Salih of Tosya. Now Tosya, it's important that it's close to Ankara, and he comes from a family deeply rooted in that town that I'm sure is awash with news about nearby towns, maybe competition, maybe with admiration, but definitely carrying some local information. So he writes again, while Murad is in Edirne, busy thinking of a plan against the infidels, he hears of something in Ankara, so he has to cross over the Dardanelles and move into Asia Minor. He says, the famous city of Ankara, in the vicinity of his well-protected realm in Anatolia, that is the western part, well-protected by the Ottomans, a city whose well-known commodity called sof, which is woven from threads of the fleece of goats specific to that region, was then as now favored and demanded by nobles and ordinary people in the lands of the infidels as well as Islam. Camlets are reaching everywhere. Giacomo Badoer, a Venetian merchant in Byzantine Constantinople in the late 1430s. We talk of it on the eve of conquest, and it's true, it's on the eve of conquest. Armies and soldiers and emperors, rulers are positioning themselves, forming leagues, da-di-da-di-da. But Giacomo Badoer spends 4 years as a Venetian merchant in Constantinople, and his account books are full of stuff coming from all over the former Byzantine world and beyond, now mostly held by different Turkish principalities, mostly the Ottomans. And Badoer's book, of course, has many references to camlets. This is 1430s, in Byzantine Constantinople, camlets are flowing, and then moving on to Florence or Venice or wherever. So it's that famous. This, back to my author, Celalzade Salih. He says, because of the popularity of its commodity, merchants came to it from faraway places. Originally, it was taken from the infidels. This city, Ankara, was taken from the infidels by the house of Seljuk of the Persian emperors. So it goes back to the Seljuks of Iran, he says. It was for a long time. It was a long time for it to be part of the abode of Islam. That's, in fact, a distinguishing characteristic of the Ankara and the region. Profound consequences for cultural history. And Western Turkish was first developed in the area between Eskişehir, Sivrihisar, Ankara, and the region. It's no surprise that Yunus Emre came from that area. It's no surprise that Tapduk is from that region, etc. But that's my cultural historian fashion. I don't want to wear it now. But the observation is important that it's been there for a long, long time. Maybe from 1100s Turkish was spoken there. 3 centuries before Istanbul Turkish, which now wants to dominate everyone else, right? I think it's worth thinking about the history of the language. So, back. At the moment of the Ottoman conquest, 12 men, now here we get a constitutional detail, 12 men known as akhis. And you know, in Dubrovnik, the city republic of Dubrovnik, they had a 12 running the show. 12 men known as akhis were governing and administering it, the city. They controlled the produce of the land, which was endlessly abundant, communally, iştirak ile, and protected it from enemies as best they could. Each one of them had at their gates and in their service, kapuda ve tapuda, several hundred soldiers with proper equipment, as is the custom of shahs, şahlar ayinince. When the state, or devlet, which might translate as felicity, when the felicity of the Ottomans started to reveal itself from where it was previously hidden, this kind of metaphorical language, some of you know, it's beautiful. Because devlet is not an institution at this point. Devlet is your heavenly mandate. When the felicity of the Ottomans started to reveal itself from where it was previously hidden by a veil of a curtain, and augmented the Ottomans' glory day by day, the fire of envy captured the hearts of the akhis of Ankara. As they corresponded with infidels ruling over the coast, whom I just mentioned, and contracted pacts with them, ahd. Ahd is something that sovereign political institutions engage in at this level with other powers against other powers. So you have them as hakim in Ankara, something like a constitutional order where 12 of them run the show with their own soldiery, and communal ownership, or I don't think it's ownership, communal management of the resources, maybe making decisions together, I think it means. And it's happening as is the custom of shahs, şahlar ayinince. Coming from somebody, as I said, with important local knowledge, writing in the mid-16th century, but carrying something, to me, very, very precious. I know I'm almost out of time. How could, given this depiction of Ankara by Cemal Kafadar, 2 sentences, how could a self-respecting Ottoman ruler not do something about it? So Murat came, stepped in, and did away with it. Did away with what? I think I made clear where I stand on the question of the political circumstances of Ankara, the akhis of Ankara, and if it ought to be considered as a kind of political formation, whether it's a republic or not, I used it in quotation marks in my abstract, of course, is another kind of discussion maybe. But it is still important to notice this audacious experiment with a non-dynastic political formation long, long, long before the 20th century. I rest my case and thank you all.
Thank you so much, Professor Kafadar, for this illuminating talk. As someone who was born and raised in Ankara, I felt kind of proud to have heard the name of Ankara mentioned numerous times for the past hour. But I have to say that we only have 15 minutes until the reception will start. So let me remind all our audience that we're going to have a reception from 6 to 7. You're all invited. And I really don't want to dominate the conversation. I want to give the audience a chance to raise their questions. So if anyone has any questions, please raise your hands, and I'll really appreciate if you can also identify yourselves before you
come to the microphone, please.
First of all, thank you so much. It was a delight, and I love the title. My question obviously is not about the beginning of the philosophy of the argument.
Hocam mikrofon alır mısınız?
And I noticed that you started this obsession of the Ottomans with akhis in 1912. Oh, sorry.
You dated it from 1912. Now, I'm going to speculate a little bit because I have one obsessive thing about 1908 and the way in which the Ottomans translate liberté, égalité, fraternité, hürriyet, müsavat, uhuvvet. And uhuvvet, I mean, even by Ottoman standards, it's kind of a weird term. They have kardeşlik, kardeşlik. I've always wondered why they used uhuvvet. And now, I wonder if there's any way you could stretch a little bit your periodization and find cases of the interest for the akhis starting already in the late 1900s that might explain that had some kind of, it's pure speculation, a pseudo-epiphany, but I would love that to be true.
I think that I'm onto something. Thank you. It's an inspiring question. I'll think of it. First of all, I gave the date 1912 only because reports were written then. But for the reports to be written, commissioned, interest must have started obviously before. How much earlier? I don't know. But there was an interest in medieval Anatolian history as a source of inspiration for various modernizing projects or various new thoughts regarding the times, but possibly looking for legitimation from medieval roots. And this would be one of them, and the conversation about the akhis may well have started earlier. This particular discussion in writing starts in 1912, but I think it's worth looking into some of the chronicles of the time, some of the publications of the time. Very good question. Working, but definitely they must have had something in their minds to commission. It's likewise with Alevis. It's a Committee of Union and Progress that commissions the first mapping, not a report in the same sense, but the first mapping of the Alevi communities of Asia Minor, for instance. That too must have been initiated by earlier concerns and thoughts.
Can you wait for the microphone?
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious about whether it's Erol Hakan. I'm a mathematician, nothing to do with history, except for studying history. A year after Cemal at Robert College, so. Is this Ankara phenomena and the akhis phenomena, the ruling of that, a singularity? Did it actually happen elsewhere? And is that like a political formation, or is it something that, it's one of a kind?
Yeah, I skipped over a page which is critical in this. Ibn Battuta, whose travel routes we are looking at, with some enigma there. I think with Eda's help we'll get to the bottom of it, but it just doesn't jive the way it is described, and it has been noted by many people that there's something wrong with the itinerary, but at the same time it gives us such very good info. Anyway, about the akhis, he is hosted, he doesn't go to Ankara unfortunately. That green line, he comes close This is the road I prefer to Ankara. This road than to Ankara, but he comes to Geyve, Göynük, Mudurnu, and then veers this way to go to Crimea. And he's traveling in 1330s, early 1330s. The precise year is not clear. So he is hosted almost everywhere he goes, including sometimes a mountain top, but mostly cities, by akhis. Let me show you. For the sake of time, I eliminated some of my comments, but here, this is a map of the mentions of akhis that Eda has prepared from the 11th roughly to the 15th century. Not in Batuta only, in any kind of source that we currently have access to. This is the kind of map, a few in Thrace as you see, but it's mostly an Anatolian phenomenon. And the word when used here is not necessarily meaning the same institutional thing. So he has this general thing to say in Batuta, 1330s, about the akhis, which answers, I think, your question. The singer over here, they exist in all the lands of the Turkmens, of El-Ru, meaning Hegemony, in every district, city, and village. Nowhere in the world are there to be found any to compare with them in solicitude for strangers and in ardor to serve food and satisfy wants. They are hosting it and lavishly if they can. To restrain the hands of the tyrannous and to kill the agents of police acting for tyrannical rulers. He says, is something that may have political consequences, especially about their communal management. His associates, the leader, is described, and then his associates work during the day to gain their livelihood. And after the afternoon prayer, they bring in their collective earnings. With this they buy fruit, food, and the other things needed for consumption in the hospice. If during that day a traveler alights at the town, they give him lodging with them, which is how Ibn Battuta travels. Then they sing and dance after the communal meal. Nowhere in the world have I seen men more chivalrous in conduct than they are. You know, we could always exaggerate in our praise of our hosts, that's okay. So on and so forth. So there is something about their communal life and about their relationship to politics vis-a-vis, defying the tyrants. Almost anywhere he goes, otherwise he describes them in each and every specific unit with relevance, but this is the more general description he gives us. Other than Ankara, the one case that I looked at very closely is Konya, because we happen to have a wonderful source, Eflaki's account of the life of Mevlana Celaleddin Rumi. Detailed account of everyday social and cultural life of Konya, again in the late 13th, early 14th century, because it goes after Mevlana to his son's time, and to his father's time, before him. Akhis play a big role there, but not quite like it. But there is something about the place of akhis in times and places, as I said, when no other state structure imposes itself successfully. There is something about them that tries to fill the void. But it's only in Ankara when they are given this kind of description of really just running the show. I have dates for this that I didn't get to. Camlet is not mentioned by Pegolotti. Pegolotti is like, he's an agent of the House of Bardi in Florence, and spent several years in Cyprus in the 1320s, writing about hundreds of commodities, the prices, how weights are measured, how distances are measured by all these different. It's an amazing handbook, La Pratica della Mercatura. It's a handbook for merchants, used by many others after. So in this, he does not mention camlets. It comes to the year 1329. Ibn Battuta does not mention camlets, 1330, 32. I really think, and then before the end of the 14th century, you have camlets mentioned, as in that English dictionary gave it, but also in Italian commercial books. So something happens around the middle of the 14th century when akhis had the resources to play the role. That's what I was also trying to say. You need the resources, really. You can't just be an everyday shopkeeper and do this.
Thank you for inspiring lecture. Vinoam Shalem from Art History. I wonder about the technique of weaving, and I'm saying that because there is even earlier source, and that's Maimonides, because Maimonides, when he's in Cairo, he's writing a specific tractate which is called Megaim, which is about this specific thing that cannot be woven together because they are like haram. You cannot wear them. And he's talking about the wool of camels, wool of the hair of arnab, and also the wool of the goat and the sheep, and which is called samer rechelim. And he's saying if you have a mixture of both of them, you cannot wear it. But he gave some possibility to wear if there is more wool of camel than those of the sheep or the goat. So do we know about the mixture between different, or is it pure the goat wool that you're talking here?
I wish. But one thing I know is that they mixed silk sometimes. Would that be forbidden for Maimonides? Goat's hair and silk.
He has also something about silk, like the silk, I can't remember, but it meant the other thing is linen and cotton. Shouldn't be mixed.
I see. I don't know the weaving technique. I should look now. You remind me that there's so much more to learn about this. But I've not seen goat's hair and camel's hair used together. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. I haven't seen it.
So interesting. I always thought was actually just
Thank you, Professor Cemal Kafadar, for a great lecture. My question is regarding Iskandername. Is Iskandername I
All right.
Yes, there I read an account of Ankara where Ahmedi says Murad II entered room, inflicted severe damage on the Kaiser, and captured the city of Ankara. So by reading this, I understood actually my reading of this account was Murad II invaded the territory of the Arabs, because later he says, Bayezid II conquered Sivas and Tokat, and Ahmedi refers to these cities as the cities of Rum. So I understood Ankara at this period, at this time, was under Arab control in some sense. So I'm wondering whether there were any association between the Arabs and Ankara in later source. And the other question I have is about the trade routes that were connected to Ankara. So if there were some textiles that were exported from Ankara, in which ways did they travel to Europe or Afghanistan, as you mentioned?
Trade routes and Eretnets. Yes. To bring this really closer to home, I think the akhis of Ankara ruled between 1343 and 61. Murad I, by the way, not Murad II.
Oh,
right?
sorry.
Right. So Murad I took it in 1361. In 1343 is the last Eretnit coin minted in Ankara. Coin mintage is obviously a very big part of it. But after 1343, no coins are minted in Ankara until you have Ottoman coins, much later, not under Murad. So looking at the coinage history, I really thought that it would be a moment of a couple of decades, roughly, where the akhis would have this kind of clout, though they may have enjoyed not istiqlal, but serious power, even under the Eretnets, because during the later period of the Eretnets, it's an offshoot of the Mongols that ruled as one of the principalities, but not as Turkmen. And yes, it's very interesting, important. Thank you. Trade routes. And there are several, right? I mean, I still go by Teschner's, der anatolische Wegenetz. Do you know Franz Teschner, who's also a great student of Futuva and Akhis, published a book called The Anatolian Road Network in German, Anatolische Wegenetz. And in that one, he gives you a very good idea of how they are connected. I think it's still not surpassed. One also looks at caravanserais, not just the roads, but how they are lined up. And in this case, of course, the Hans tell you. So, Ankara, Ayaş, Beypazarı, Nallı Han, Mudurnu, Göynük, etc. Taraklı Yenicesi, Geyve. It's a beautiful road, by the way. I find it still captivating.
Let's get to questions.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
This is not a topic I know a lot about, but I was wondering if you could say to what extent you know about the institutional structure of the akhis and what connection, if any, that has with the institutional structures of the Bektashis or even the Kızılbaş.
No, that's a big one.
Shall we do the second question? Second question.
Good question. Very big.
I guess to follow up from that, we see that a lot of the early modern Istanbul guild vocabulary is inherited from the akhis, but I guess the mainstream argument is that the actual guild structure was from like transplanted Egyptian, guilds, which I think, I don't know, my uneducated opinion is that it's like they were fashioned after like Genoese factories who again had like some guild-like structure. But I guess my question is how much of it is actually like the structure besides the rituals of like unwritten rituals were actually inherited by like institutionally inherited by akhis. What I mean is Ottoman Istanbul guilds.
Great. I mean, these are big questions. I'm saying not to complain. They are of great interest to me, but I don't know how to do it concisely. Now, about the akhis, many of us, and I'm definitely still of the opinion that Gabriel Bayer offered many decades ago regarding the difference between akhis and the guilds. The akhis were craftsmen and tradesmen and merchants and shopkeepers, etc., just like members of guilds. But akhis were not professionally organized. The akhis of a town from different professions came together and were part of that community. Whereas when you get to the guilds, you have shoemakers and the belt makers and the candle makers. You know what I mean? Strictly organized within that. I mean, the guilds are so jealous of their professional identity and protectionism of the raw material rights, for instance, right? No other guild should capture the raw materials that you need to make belts, kind of thing. And that's very different. But the principles of Futuva were still very dearly held by them. So something like a code of conduct was important for them. Texts were translated, Fütüvetnames were translated with appeal to guild members of guilds. It's translated into Turkish. The first Turkish Fütüvetname is mid-14th century, Burgazi. In the same period when the akhis were, in a position to assert themselves, I think. But the ritual and the organization, I'm moving away from your question, but your question also has something to do with the akhis. What we know is that they had a hierarchy, the sheikh or ahibaba, different words, but usually sheikh or ahibaba, and then yiğitbaşı, the head of the young men. Remember, feta meant young man. futuwa and qualities of a young man, expected of it. So Yiğit, the Turkish rendering of young man, and then you had the Yiğits, the people, but young here does not necessarily give you any age, right? I mean, we know that people in their 50s and 60s, Ibn Battuta says one of them was over 100, but he calls them a Yiğit. This is the metaphorical kind of, or institutional, technical term. And in the guild, something similar happened, especially with tanners, it seems, that the traditions of the akhis survived very strongly. And all the way into the late 18th century, we have a document in which tanners, deba, from Elbasan in Albania, write to Kırşehir to get ijazet, a document license, for appointing a new ahibaba over there in Elbasan, Albania. So the tanners continue. Kırşehir is the shrine of Agi Evran, the 13th century character, another one of those 13th century characters of Central Anatolia that I mentioned as the formative area of Western Turkish language and many other things. I did not mention Armenians, of course, they were a big part of this. But how much can one do? Armenians also had a futuwa like 13th, 14th, 15th centuries. They had a very direct counterpart of the futuwa associations. In Erzincan, it was a very strong, and they wrote also futuvetname types of codes of conduct with very similar content. Rachel Goshgarian has studied this phenomenon, among others. So, but the Bektashis, again, there are many. This is like one of the biggest questions for the future of research, in my opinion. Bektashis and Alevis, the type of organization of these communities, types of ceremonial, like I refer to singing and dancing of the akhis, right? Even but that doesn't describe it any further. But it certainly had a ritual order, right? Edeb erkan would be the word for it. Seyr-i Süluk is another word for it. Some of the Fütüvetname texts are very clearly inspired by something close to Bektashism. But the precise connections, nobody is directly. People claim that they existed and they were like very close to one another, or simply skirt the issue. But nothing that I would consider to be the job is done, unfortunately.
Before we move to the reception, let me use the privilege of being the moderator and ask a quick question about the Battle of Ankara and its memory, because in 1402, Ottomans were nominally destroyed by the Timurids, and there wasn't any more kind of Ottoman state by then. I wonder if the memory, the negative memory of the Battle of Ankara, had any impact on the later imaginations of the city in positive or negative terms.
Right, that's also a good thing to consider and explore. Now, for those who ascribe a moral deficiency to the defeat in Ankara are those early chronicles that don't even say anything about Ankara, right? Because after the Battle of Ankara, Aşık Paşazade, Oruç, the anonymous chronicles, in various degrees of critique, they all say the first three rulers were upright, good people, but Bayezid brought scholars from the Persian world who brought corruption and bribery. He married a Serbian princess who brought wine and carousing in the court, kind of corrupt corporate life, right? And he initiated fratricide. Kardeş katletmek yoydu until kind of phrase. So there is a very strong moralizing critique of the defeat in Ankara by different voices in the 15th century. They think it happened because the Ottomans had taken the wrong road. Until Bayezid, they were a sturdy people. It says, do you remember? So, but Ankara doesn't play into this. Interestingly, I'm thinking after what you said. And then you get the villainous Ankara represented much, much later by Celalzade Salih and Hoca Saadettin Efendi in the mid and late 16th century. But I'll keep my eyes open.
Well, please join me in thanking Professor Kafadar.
Thank you.